Well, hello everybody and welcome to this midweek video where I take viewers' images and go over some of my processing techniques. Some of these images folk might be having problems with or have a question or just want to see how I would approach their image with my own processing. This week's photograph is an image by Andrzej Jakubowski. I hope I got your name there right, Andrzej. And it's a photograph taken in the Tatra Mountains in Slovakia. And Andrzej says in his problem text here that it was taken minutes before a storm, but he thinks he missed the light in the foreground. He ended up with black and white version of the image as he was struggling with the color. And the colors have never seemed quite right to him. And he also finds the foreground and midground a bit too flat. Here's the raw file. And I think the first thing I'm going to do is just start off with some really basic adjustments just to kind of flatten out the image a little bit. And it's kind of counterproductive because I might change some things here to flatten out, but then I add contrast and brighten them up again. So you'll just have to bear with me here. First thing I'm going to do is darken this corner here a little bit. So there's a number of ways we can do that, but I think what I'm going to do is just use a radial gradient. Let's just reduce the size of the image here. Here's our radial gradient. Just turn it around a little bit. And if you're having a hard time seeing what it's actually doing, you can just click on this little box up here, and that'll actually put the mask on it for you so you can see or get a bit of an idea of what's happening here. And all I'm going to do is just start darkening that section up there, like so. Like that. That's good enough. All right, that's our first mask. Now then, second mask. This time I'm going to click on color range and I want to really brighten up this road. So let's just pick a bit of the road here. Let's just see how that looks. Did a pretty good job, except I don't want to include all of this stuff here. So I think what I'm going to do is just slowly refine this. We can bring this back ever so slightly, this slider here. And I'm just going to click on the minus sign, grab a brush, and I'll just, what's the flow at? Let's go 100% here, or close to 100%. And we're just going to get rid of that area there. Let's just bring this brush a bit smaller. Reduce the feathering. So with processing, I think the problem that a lot of people have is that there are just too many options. And I do believe that, I mean, sometimes it's nice to experiment, but it's a good idea if you have a bit of a kind of an idea of where you want to take your photograph beforehand. Now, sometimes there's some nice little surprises in there, and you know that's great. But personally, I like to define, well, what is it that I want to do with this photograph, and where do I want to draw the viewer's attention? So I've already defined that the sky was quite bright, but that's not really where I want to bring people's attention. I really wanted to bring them down this road here. So having said that, let's just bring the exposure up on the road here, like so. And we can also bring the whites up and the highlights. That's the first step. Next step is we want to create a mask for this area here. And you're probably wondering, well, why am I not just doing this globally? Why am I creating all these masks? Well, the nice thing about masks is that you can, the more you have, the more control you have over those little areas. Now, having said that, you don't want to create too many masks, otherwise it gets really confusing. So let's try another mask here where I just want to include the greens. this whole midsection here. We'll deal with the mountains in a little bit. Let's try color range again, and we'll just grow a little circle and see what happens here. Does a pretty good job. Let's try and refine that a bit more. It's done a pretty good job actually. So what I'm going to do with this is, again, just grab minus, brush, and I'm just going to paint out this here because we don't want our adjustments to really affect the roads too much. Doesn't have to be really accurate or anything like that. So if there's a bit of mask bleeding over, it's not a huge deal. We can always deal with that afterwards if it looks a bit odd. Same with this area here. And let's just grab the plus here, brush. I just want to make sure that we get all of these trees in here. Like so. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do now is do exactly the same thing. I'm just going to start bringing up the exposure. But I wanted to bring it up to a point where it's believable. Like something like that is just not believable. And also you got to remember that you've got to deal with the masking here. You don't want to get any kind of haloing or fringes around those masks. So that's an overall exposure. But now what we want to do is we just want to bring up the brighter areas and not necessarily the shadows. So we can do that by just grabbing the whites. So by doing that, we're actually adding some contrast in there. We can try the highlights as well. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, lastly, we want to deal with the background here, because if we zoom in, you can see that the transition here looks absolutely horrible. And I just noticed that Andre has some, looks like there's some water drops on here, so we're going to have to deal with those at some point as well. Right, next step. Let's just zoom out again. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to grab, let's try the color range again, see what that does. And we're just going to grab a little bit of the mountain here and see what kind of filter that gets. And it does a pretty darn good job. We can paint in the whole sky here so we don't get any weird things happening. And we can paint out this section here. That's where the water drops are. So what are we going to do on this section? Well, I think what I'd like to do is start to give it a little bit of dehaze and also the exposure. I'd like to brighten that up just a tad to that point there. Now then, excuse me, if we just turn that off a minute. If we zoom in, we do have some weird things going on with the trees up here. So what I'm going to try and do is just feather that out ever so slightly. So we're on the sky mask here. And what I'd like to do is just extend that mask. So I'm going to grab the plus, brush, and I'll turn the mask on again so we can see what we're doing. Except this time we're going out quite far. Let's bring that up to 33%. And we're going to feather this quite a bit. Bring the flow down. And we'll just turn that off now. Now let's just see if we can feather this. Let's make the brush a bit bigger. So I'm just feathering over the tops of the trees here. So let's just zoom in on that. And you can see that already it's starting to look a little bit better. We can actually, let's turn the auto mask on. Sorry, I should have done that earlier. Now my computer's having a little bit of trouble with this because we're zoomed in quite way. There we go. Okay, now if you go too far, you can adjust the amount. Now the trees are starting to look a little bit weird. So what I'm going to do on this one, I'm going to grab this mask here, and I'm actually going to, let's have a look at the mask here. So for this one, like these trees back here, they're causing a little bit of a problem. So rather than masking them out, what I'm going to do is actually erase some of that mask. So we've got the brush, and that should darken the trees and make them look a little bit more believable. Same with the tops of the trees here. You'll notice how it's slowly getting darker, because that's from the original file before the mask. See, that's the problem with when you start masking out skies and foregrounds, is that you get this transition line. So the hard part is trying to make it look believable and transitioning those two masks so that they kind of intertwine with one another without being too jarring, if that makes sense. As you can see, it's definitely a little bit darker up here, but I think we've done a pretty good job of the transition line here. Right then, so what else am I going to do here? Well, I'd really like to emphasize this road even more. So what I'm going to do is grab the road mask here, and I'm actually going to duplicate it so it has that effect twice. Now you can see this is way too much, but we can reduce the amount to the point where we like it to taste, like so. I like it quite bright. I think it's a really nice feature of this. But of course, as I said before, you can go a whole bunch of different ways with this. If we compare it to Andre's, which I really like it, and it looks quite believable, the only thing I would do to improve this would just to bring up the highlights and the whites. The version I'm doing is quite a bit more vibrant. It's probably more about what it looked like at the time, perhaps. If you find that the foreground is too bright, like if you don't like this foreground, then you can just click on that mask and then just bring that effect down a little bit. So there's a whole bunch of different things you can do here with all of these different masks. And it didn't take a lot of effort on my part to create them. Okay, lastly, what I'd like to do is just add some contrast to the top here in the clouds. I could use a radial gradient again, or a linear gradient, but I think what I'm going to do is just actually use a paintbrush. I'm just going to reduce the paintbrush size here. And I'm just going to paint this midsection. Just turn the mask on here. Like so. And I'm just going to add contrast. Add a little bit of contrast up there. Play around with the shadows a little bit. I don't want to make them too brooding. Something like that. I also like the 4:5 aspect ratio. Something like that. Now this section here, I'm not going to address that too much in this, because that would take a little bit of time. One way you could try and just reduce the water spots there, because they've lost contrast there, is again, you could just grab a paintbrush and we're just going to paint Okay, that's not perfect, but it looks a little bit better than it did. We'd have to really kind of play around with that. Perhaps in Photoshop it might do a better job. Okay, now I'd really like to bring up these highlights just a little bit more in the trees back here and the grasses. And I find it much easier in Photoshop. So I'm just going to open up this in Photoshop and use some luminosity masks. All right, I've opened this up in Photoshop. And what I'm going to do is just go to Lumenzia here. And I just want to check out some masks here. Let's try this one here. Yeah, so the lighter gray here, if I get a dodge tool, a brush, I could probably brighten up those areas in the foreground here and also in the trees in the background here. So let's select that. I'm just going to grab a dodge tool from TK Panel and Command or Control H to hide those marching ants. I'm going to keep the flow at 8% on this one, just to speed things up just a little bit. Make sure we've got a nice brush, zero hardness. And I'm just going to start painting this section in here. And it should just brighten up the highlights. On the road here as well. Also on the side here, get some contrast with those grasses. And then in the shrubs and the trees. Back here. Now I think the foreground is probably enough. So we're just going to work on the trees back here a little bit. And it, you know, as I said before, it looks like there's nothing going on here. But if I click the mask on and off, you can see how much we've actually brightened up those highlight areas and how much micro contrast we've added to those little areas. And I think that'll do it. And, you know, as I've said before, again, if you think you've gone too far with it, sometimes it's a good idea to step away from your image for a while and then come back with fresh eyes. And you can always just reduce the opacity if you think you've gone too far with it. So let's save this and compare it to Andre's original file. And then you can, in the comments, you can tell me which one you prefer. So save. And let's go to Lightroom. So you've got this one. And here's Andre's original. All right. Well, those are the techniques that I know. And they've worked for me up until this point. So I hope you got something out of this video. Please be sure to give me the thumbs up if you did enjoy it. And just to mention, next week, I probably won't have any videos for a couple of weeks because I'm off to Spain for several weeks. But I promise that I'll have some new material when I return. All right, folks, until next time, thanks ever so much. Bye-bye.